This is a review of Gemara in Nazir Daf Beis. So the Mishnah began with a bit of a seesaw. It started with din number 1, that the kinuyim, the nicknames of Naziris, have the same status of Naziris. Then it said, if someone said a yad, I shall be, he is a Nazir. Then the Mishnah continued and said, what are forms of kinuyim of nicknames? Nazik, Naziach, and Paziach. The Mishnah then continued by saying other forms of Harini Kazeh, or if I'm Mesalsel, or Mechalkel, or I'm going to grow my hair. These are all forms of Naziros. Whereas finally, if someone says, I'm going to bring birds, Rab Meir says he's a Nazir, and the Chachamim say no. So we begin the Gemara with a classical Gemara question. Where is this coming from? Why in the world, in the middle of Nashim, are we discussing about Nazirus? And the Gemara explains the fundamental din about Nashim. It says that if it doesn't find favor in one's eyes, then could come a divorce. And what is the impetus of the divorce? Is because the wife might have been unfaithful. And why was she mezaneh? Because she drank wine. And from there we learn, if you see a saita bilkil kula, you see a saita unfortunately blowing yourself up, you see that she was unfaithful, and therefore the waters in the Beis HaMikdash caused her to die. Yazir atzmai min hayayin. And that is the reason why we learn Nazir in the middle of Nashim. And from there we continued and gone into the order of the Mishnah. The Mishnah began with Kinuyim. The Mishnah continued with Yadais. And then it explained the Kinuyim. What's going on over here? So it says, teretz number 1 of the Gemara comes along Rava, and Rava says that there are words missing in the Mishnah. You have to read the Mishnah as follows. All nicknames, all Kinuyim of Naziris are like Naziris. And then you insert in the following words. The Yadais of Naziris are like Naziris. Once we inserted in those words, now we can explain what are the yadais if someone says, hey, etc. Ask the Gemara, beautiful explanation, but why don't we just explain the kinuyim first? Says the Gemara, teretz number 1, because we said din A, kinui nickname, din B, yadais. So now we explain din B before we go back and explain din A. And says the Gemara, we find 3 times in Shas the same thing. These are all 3 cases in which a Mishnah says yes and no. What can you echo out? What can you not go out? What can you yes light with? What can you not light with? What can you yes do atman with? What can you not do atman with? And in all these 3 cases, we first explain B, and then we explain A. Says the Gemara, so too in our Mishnah we explain B, and then we explain A, we explain Yadais, and then we explain the Kinuyim. Says the Gemara, that's beautiful with those 3 Mishnayis. But what about their other Mishnayis? And in these cases, we don't explain B, case 2, before case A. Rather, we go back and explain case A. So answers the Gemara, fundamental answer, 3 lines from the bottom, the Gemara answered, La'aylam, we do it both ways. And now we have to explain each case why we did that. When it comes to the Isser Dinavshei, like B'meh Isha Yaitza, like B'meh Malikin, then we explain the root Isser first. When it comes to not an Isser of the person himself, but one's animal, then we explain the Heter first. And with that, we move over to Beis Amid Beis, and the Gemara continues to explain that when it comes to Yesh Neichlin, the Mishnah Baba Basra, why do we explain A first? The reason is because first we explain the Iker, the main din of Nachla, and then we explain everything else. So after giving us an explanation of all the other Mishnayos, says the Gemara, so why in our Mishnah didn't we first explain the Kinuyim? And finally we go full circle, and the Gemara answers, you know why? Since the din of Yadais, the din of an unclear statement that we translate as a neder is learnt out from a medrash, it is chaviv, it is dear, and that's why we explain it first. So if it's so dear, why did the Mishnah say the din of Yadais first? Says the Gemara, you know why? Because we start with the Iker. The Iker Karban is the case of Kinuyin, and then we explain what's Tirtzatz, which is the case of Yadais. And now we're at the 2 dots of Bezim and Bez, and the Gemara says the first case of Yadais, ehei. Says the Gemara, how do you know ehei I should be is the case of Yadais? Maybe it means it's a case of Tainis. Says the Gemara, quoting Shmuel, you know how? Because it was a Nazir Iver Lefanav, and that's going to be the basic idea of really to whole Daf Gimel, that the only way that we know is we have an external factor showing us what he meant. Says the Gemara, is this a proof that Shmuel holds that in general, if we're not sure what your statement means, it's not a good statement? So when he said, hey, we're not sure, it's not a good statement, says the Gemara, no, it's not a proof. Just if there's a Nazir over lefanov, then there's no suffix at all. But if not, there's going to be a suffix. Says the Gemara, because maybe he meant Dilma Betainis. Ask the Gemara, wait, maybe it means he wants to pater himself from a carbon. Says the Gemara, you know why? Because he says, I was thinking I want to be a Nazir. Says the Gemara, okay, now the whole thing just blew up. If he's thinking he wants to be a Nazir, and he says, hey, then it's obvious. Says the Gemara, no, there's still a chiddush. Because you would think you need pid, his mouth, and his heart to be the same. His mouth says, I should be. His heart says, I should be a Nazir. Maybe that's not called being the same. Kamashlan, that's the chiddush of the Mishnah, of the case of a hey, and Amir Tashem, another chazara for Daf Gimel tomorrow.